So I was confused because I thought this was going to be, because we haven't done this in a while, Holly, like a Holly and Friends episode.
Yeah, it kind
But
of is, because we do float in the same circle. I've
Right.
seen our guests today on different Zoom meetings, but we've never hung out.
Okay, because I was like, well, if Stephanie's a friend of Holly, and then I saw that you were a friend with Lori, I'm just like, okay, the only one who doesn't have a friendship yet is me and you. Stephanie Beaulieu, how are you?
Good. I'm so glad to be here.
All right. So by the end of this, the goal, I think, is for you no longer to be friends with Holly, and then you and I start hanging out.
Yeah.
Okay.
Is that too much?
Yeah.
Well, can we all be friends? I mean,
why can't we be friends?
Yeah, I think that should be a song.
That's a good anyway.
We're all in this together.
Exactly.
So you are from originally where, Steph?
I was born in Richmond, British Columbia. My dad immigrated to Vancouver in the 70s, so I'm half Filipino by heritage, Canadian by birth, and my mom is Canadian, so I'm half Filipino. And so I get that question a lot of like, where are you from, or what are you?
Right? I hate those questions. I'm human, but thanks. Thank you.
Or like, what's your ethnic background? People are just trying to find out what your ethnic mix is, but there's some very interesting ways of asking that question.
Well, because Holly usually gets, I mean, I've known you forever. You get an array of different, like, are you this or are you this?
Yeah.
Or
yeah. Are you Latina? No.
Yeah.
I wish. Oh, goodness. Yeah. So, Johnny, I think there is hope for you and friendship at the end. Maybe.
Absolutely.
All right. I'm good with that.
There's always hope.
There's always hope.
So you had a Filipino dad, a Canadian mom, and you grow up in Western Canada. Did you ever feel like you were different because you had multicultural family and parents from different places?
Yeah, absolutely. We moved to Cochrane, Alberta when I was 3 years old. And at the time, this is not the case today, but at the time, my dad was one of 3 non-Caucasian people. So like the kids in elementary school had never seen black hair. And so I kind of grew up, Filipino culture is warm, it's welcoming, it's amazing, but I always felt like I wasn't quite Filipino enough to be considered Filipino, and I wasn't quite Canadian enough. So, when you're kind of a cross-culture kid like that, sometimes you don't really exactly know where you fit. So that was definitely a bit of my experience growing up.
I also had a similar experience because I grew up just outside of Edmonton.
Yeah.
And it's like, you can count the non-white people on one hand.
One hand.
Didn't even need my thumb. But I don't know, like for me, it made me on an earlier level, an earlier age, and try to figure out who I was and my identity. For you and your own self-identity, was that early questions from a young age?
Yeah, I think I was a pretty like happy-go-lucky kind of kid. So I don't know that I maybe noticed right away. Like I would my husband is Filipino too, and he's very aware of like those kinds of things. But it's funny, I think I always felt pretty white, but so sometimes when I'm like somewhere, it's like I forget, and then if there's people, like if you're in a small town Alberta and people are kind of looking, I'm like, what are they looking? Oh right, like right, I'm a visible minority, I forgot. So yeah, and I think too, like my mom is Canadian, and I have heard that whatever your mother's culture is has more influence in the home. So I have friends who are half Filipino whose mom was Filipino, and they ate more Filipino food, felt more Filipino, kind of grew up more, submerged in the culture. Whereas I just kind of felt like, I'm just here, and I'm happy to be here. And then so I always have to like remind myself, the joke was that I was a coconut, like brown on the outside, white on the inside.
I love that. That was me too. I was a rebel. I was a chocolate ice cream bar because I was white on the inside and brown on the out. Yeah. Exactly. So I totally feel that. I think it's completely true. You really do absorb the culture of your mom.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Johnny's like, I was vanilla.
He's like, I know.
Got nothing, guys. White on the outside, white on the inside. But with that said, I was always the one who wanted to have friends of different races and ethnicities, because I felt like I wanted to learn so much. So one of my
Mm.
best friends growing up, his family was from Fiji. And
Okay.
so he recently got married. And so we got connected after, 20, it's been 10 years or something like
Yeah.
that. But I find it very interesting that there are so many different cultures. And I mean, we live in a melting pot of Canada.
Yep.
That we all kind of find our own place, despite the fact sometimes, despite the color of our skin, we all feel very different.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think in Canada, you know, even as opposed to other places in the world, there's almost like a lot more permission for diversity, whereas it's not like we're not trying to make everybody fit into one mold, but there's, you know, there's space.
It's more of a
Which is
mosaic.
mosaic. I believe that, yeah, I remember that. That's my one thing I remember from social studies.
I know,
Canada
right?
and the States is a melting pot, but it really truly is.
Yeah.
Yeah, a mosaic.
I bet you didn't think today we'd be going back to grade 8
No, I
social
didn't.
studies.
No. Shout out to Miss Oleski. See, we remember things.
There we go.
Remember. Yeah, it's true. It's true.
Oh, amazing. All right. So of course, you've got a book that just came out. You had a fantastic launch party. We can see it behind you.
Yes.
For those who are checking out our YouTube channel.
Wow.
And balloons, like quite a party. But you don't just write a book because you're like, hey, it's a Thursday and I want to write a book.
Spare time. What should I do with myself?
Yeah. Oh, man, there's nothing going on. I'm going to write a book. Let's talk about some of those life experiences that led up to writing this book.
Yeah, my dad and I were pretty close growing up. And he had 4 girls. And he just always wanted a son, but he always said he was happy that he got basketball players at least.
There you go.
Yeah. So and that's like Filipino culture is like, you must play basketball. So yeah. So I guess my why me moment would have been May 5th, 2008. And my dad called me that day and he said, hey, is Mike home? That was my husband. And I said, yeah. And I just kind of had that feeling like something's not right.
Yeah.
And then he said, are you sitting down? And I said, yeah. And by then I'm like, why? You know, like what's going on? And he said, I have really bad news. The doctor said I have ALS and I have 3 to 5, it's fatal. And I have 3 to 5 years to live. And that was just this like, what? Like, you know, he had been having this weakness in his finger since the previous January. And we thought, you know, he'll go to the doctor, they'll diagnose it, they'll give him medicine, he'll get better. Maybe it's carpal tunnel or arthritis or something like that. And just never in a million years did I expect that kind of news. So that was really a earth shattering, like, you know, and then you start, why me, why this, why now, why us, you know, why our family. So that was a really big, proponent in the story, living the story first, of course, before writing it.
Mm-hmm.
Where was he at the time?
He was living in Calgary. We were living in Lethbridge. I was like newlywed. We'd been married like 9 months. I was going to school. And you know, when you're an adult, like a young adult, there's this, I don't know, transition period where you're kind of switching from being like a kid to being like friends with your parents. And we were just kind of coming into that. And I remember a couple times that year he had called and I, you know, after a couple minutes, I'm like, Dad, why are you calling? And he's like, I just want to see how you're doing, you know? And so just that, like, oh, we're there now, you know, it's not like I'm home for dinner every night. And now you care about my life. Right. And you want to know what's going on. And so that was kind of the phone call I sort of expected once, you know, a week or once every couple of weeks. So this one just really, really took me by surprise.
So growing up in rural Alberta, small town communities, your relationship with your parents, were you guys pretty close?
Yeah. So my dad I didn't really realize this till I was writing the book, but my dad was like a brand new believer. Like he got saved when I was 4 months old. So I never knew him like pre-Jesus. But I heard stories. It's like stories that I was like, I don't think so.
A dad?
My dad's a pastor. I don't think that's real. And, but one of the things, you know, like looking back, I could always just be really real with him. Like some of these stories are in the book just where, you know, like if I was like, I remember this season, he eventually went into ministry and he was really busy and I was probably junior high and he would drive me to school. And this one day he was like, Steph, what's new in your life? And I was like staring out the window, like arms crossed. And I was normally just like, you know, chatty. And I looked at him and I said, you never have any time for me anymore. And now you want to know like what's
Aw.
new in my life, and just like fire. Like I was probably, I don't know, 14, just angry. And but he never was like, how dare you speak to me like that, young lady, like he just was really humble and really approachable. And so that always lent itself to, I couldn't speak my mind with everybody, but I could always, with my dad, just kind of like let out whatever was there. And it was just never met with judgment. So that was kind of the back and forth, kind of that we had, in our relationship.
You say that your dad became a Christian and you were just a wee little baby.
Yes.
When did your journey with your
Yeah.
faith begin?
Yeah. I was the rebel age of 8. I always kind of joke. So my parents, I knew they had these really dramatic conversion stories. And so growing up, I always thought like, I don't have a story. Like, it's just really boring. It's not like I was like running with the wrong crowd on the wrong side of the tracks, like 6, 7, but I remember feeling that tug, like back in the day, they would always give an invitation at the end of every church service, like to walk the aisle, right? And go up to the front and give your life to Jesus. And I remember quite like, even at that age, I remember understanding that I was giving up control, and I was a very like strong personality, like middle child. And I remember not wanting to do that actually. And I remember feeling that kind of like tug into the aisle and just being like, nah, maybe later. And then one day I was homesick from school. One day my mom was watching 100 Huntley Street. She always watched that. And I said, Mom, if I die and go to hell, can I change my mind? And then she goes, no, like when it's done. And I'm like, okay, then so am I, with like doing things my own way. Like, let's pray. So I was in grade 3. I was 8 years old when I, went from darkness to light in the spiritual. And I remember my dad came home that day and I'm like, I invited someone today. And so he's guessing my teacher and my neighbor and my friends. And I'm like, no, better. And then finally I was like, Jesus, of course he probably knew, but he played along. Yeah. And so that was the beginning. And then I went around the neighborhood and I repeated that news to everybody, that they needed to know Jesus. And my mom got some phone calls.
Look at you, little missionary. So
Right?
you had
a
said,
little evangelist. And she was like, now I'm much more relational in how I share Jesus. But at the time, I was like, you need to trust Jesus too.
Yeah.
You're like the Oprah. You get a Jesus, and you get a Jesus. Now, was I wrong? And you said that your dad was a pastor?
Yeah, so he was a mechanic. He immigrated from the Philippines in the 70s. His dad had a shop in the Philippines, so he just continued with that trade after he got saved, and just like no one thought he would ever get saved, and he got saved. And a couple of weeks later, some coworkers, they were just talking, and he told one of them that he'd read this article about this workplace that had started a Bible study and it had improved productivity and all these things. And before he knows it, these two coworkers are bantering back and forth about how they wouldn't attend a Bible study if Jesse started one. And he's like, oh, what's happening? And before he knew it, there was a sign on the break room wall that said Bible study 6 a.m. Jesse's bringing donuts. And he's like, what just happened? So he was like a 4-week-old Christian, and like doing this early morning Friday Bible study. And over the course of about a year and a half, I think, just barely knew anything, but giving away what he now knew. And then one day the Lord spoke to him and just said, this is your training ground. And he was like, training for what? And then shortly after that, he felt called to ministry. And I don't even know, Johnny, like if he would have technically known what ministry was at that point.
Yeah, sure.
But the seminary in Cochrane had just opened. And so they a whole series of events of putting out the fleece and asking God, but they ended up moving our family, and he started joined a Filipino Bible study that kind of accidentally grew into a church. And so they literally just found himself as a pastor. And someone they used to call him Brother Jesse. And one day someone called him Pastor Jesse, and he said, well, I guess if this is a church, then I'm the pastor. Like that was how that happened. So it was not like planned, it was just like God just kind of ushered him into that. So, yeah.
Did you feel any pressure being the daughter of the pastor?
Yeah. I feel like people would say it to me. They'd be like, oh, you're the pastor's kid. So I felt it maybe at a distance a bit from people, but not really ever from my parents. They were just really real and like really authentic, and they made mistakes. They would apologize and ask for our forgiveness, if they lost their temper or whatever. So I didn't feel like there wasn't a lot of pretense in our house. And so I felt like that kind of don't get me wrong, I was afraid to like, I never like afraid to step over the wrong side of the tracks for sure. And that's a bit in the book too. My mom just came from a really broken string of life choices and stuff. So she had really strict rules for us because she knew the sadness and emptiness that sin left her with. So we told the line just because we were like I was scared of my mom in a really healthy way. And so I never like had the desire to rebel. And I just, I think it's very normal for people to question, their faith and is God real and is faith from my parents. But God was so real to my parents that honestly, that was just never, for me, it was never like, is he real? It was just like, will I follow him? Like that was the question for me, but he had so changed their lives that there was almost no denying, it. And so I didn't feel that pressure from my parents, but definitely people occasionally would be like, oh, you're the pastor's kid. And it was like, what does that mean? Like, we weren't around long enough to know, like in church culture long enough. So,
I mean, there's not the pressure per se, but as you grow older, there's then, hey, what are you going to be when you grow up? Did you think ministry was one of those things? Did you think that, taking things like bite-sized Bible studies would grow into what it is? Like, where did you feel like your heart was being led to?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's a great question. I remember I went to Bible college for 1 year out of high school, and that kind of gave me that buffer, when you're like, I have no idea what I want to do with my life. This buys me some time. And after that year, I decided I wanted to go into education, actually. And I kind of was like, I want to make a difference. So teaching makes the most sense, to me. So I had done my education degree. And then when I was like weeks away from graduating, a friend and we were sitting outside my house, I remember in like my Toyota Corolla. And I said to her, I don't think I'm going to be a classroom teacher. And she's like, what do you mean? Like, we're about to graduate. Like, what are you planning? And I said, I don't know. I feel like maybe I'll be like teaching the Bible. And by then my dad had been gone for a year probably. And in that season, just of being really desperate to know that what God said was real, I mean, it just really, scriptures came alive to me. And so I think that was the beginning of the birthplace of some passion for that. But I never, I didn't have a plan. I didn't have like a 5-year and a 10-year, like it kind of, I guess, similar to my dad's calling, it just kind of happened.
So you graduate and what happens next? You're like, okay, I could be a teacher, but I really I want something to serve God with.
Yeah. So I got my first job of all things was kindergarten, and I had a phys ed degree with a math minor.
Nice.
And they offered me this job, and I think I said, are you sure? Anyways, but it ended up being just a really fun year. My husband always accused me of like, all you do is play. I was like, we learn. It's how we learn. But yes, it's a really fun job. Then we moved here to Airdrie. My husband had gotten transferred, and I got a teaching job for a bit. And then we started our family. And in the course of that year, I was kind of taking a year off. And my mom, who works for our convention and does women's ministry, she just asked me one day kind of casually, like, oh, are you planning to go back to work? And I said, do you know what my dream job would be? I was like, if I could like work from home and like teach the Bible, like I would just love that. And she goes, well, let's try it. Like, why don't we just pick? She's like, why don't we do a Bible study on James? And so back then what year was it? 2013, probably. And we did a online Bible study. This was kind of before like online was like as much of a thing as it is today. And we just did the book of James. We recorded some videos. I wrote some homework. I just did it like 1 week at a time, like trying to write it so I could email it out to people. And that was kind of the beginning of writing Bible study. And then after that, some speaking invitations just started to come, and then a couple more Bible studies. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, it's been 10 years. Here we are. And I'm not exactly sure how it happened, other than God opens the door and kind of like ushers you through it when he wants to and when you're willing to say yes.
Yeah, it's so true. You blink and suddenly a decade has passed. But you've learned so much in those 10 years. What were some of your takeaways from starting with just, James and trying to have something for people to now?
Yeah. Couple things. One, I remember one point just feeling really overwhelmed by the online world, and like, do we go here, there, like which people, there's so much out there. And I remember God saying to me, start at home, like start with the women who are in your living room on Tuesday morning. And so I remember always having this, like, to know that this thing works, like it can't just be me and like these online people. Like I need to see you know, and like work some of these things out in real life. And then you can take that and, you know, kind of apply it a little bit wider. And so I think because of that, just kind of being committed to like real people, real life. I think when I do go and speak, even if it's an audience I don't know, you know, there's somebody with this story in the audience, and there's someone struggling with shame in this way here. And so it's like my, you know, 10 or 12 closest friends for me represent the women. Like when I go out and minister to, I know that it's them I'm still talking to, even though they're kind of different. So that would be one, you know, like the home is the hardest place to do ministry, honestly, like your own family, your own people, because they see the day in, the day out. Like you fly in for a weekend and people are like, oh, you're the speaker, and they think you're like special, and you're like, trust me, like look at my minivan, you'll know that like it looks just like yours, and I don't know how to cook chicken for like the 27th time. Like life is just really ordinary and normal and stuff. But I think, you know, keeping it real with real life people is really important. And one, I always kind of had this idea that, you know, once God was like using me or would call me, that I'd have a few more things in my life worked out or like more organized, like be better at, you know, all these things. And God just always calls me to just be really real. And lots of times, just this last weekend, my mom and I were speaking to a group of women in Texas, and we were talking about how, you know, we don't just want to share the stories of things God did 15 years ago. Like we want this thing to be fresh. Like what happened 15 minutes ago? And conveniently, I had missed my flight, like going down there. So I had some fresh, like, you know, when I said, I will only ever give you grace because I always need it. I mean, just like, you know, real life, not in a, like this one time, a really long time ago, I used to have a hard time with this thing or this struggle. I think it's just keeping it really real and trusting that in the midst of like messiness and everyday life, that God is still who he says he is. And then just being able to testify to that, I think has been really important for me in Bible study, keeping it real.
Yeah.
There's a lot of questions that I'm going to have that I'm going to try to find ways to navigate through it. But I think one of the first ones that I do want to ask is Anything But Ordinary is out officially now. You can pick it up. Why did you decide to write the book?
Yeah, great question. I mean, really in one sentence, I would say because God was faithful through a season I didn't think I'd survive. A couple months before my dad was diagnosed, this story is in the book. My husband and I were driving back home, and I said to him, just really out of the blue, I said, if anything ever happened to my dad, I would not be okay. And I just remember like sobbing, like just all of a sudden, just thinking about that and thinking like anything but that, God, you know, like that I wouldn't survive. And I remember he like reached across the car and he like grabbed my hand and he's like, your dad's fine. Like he's healthy. Like nothing's going to happen to him. And then of course it was a couple of months later that we get this news. And so I think, over the last 10 or 12 years, the thing that like makes me kind of like get up out of my seat and like want to write or want to share is when I see someone that's just going through something that's really hard, like whether that's like losing a loved one or a diagnosis or just like a hard life, you know, things not turning out the way you thought. It's like the thing I want them to know, I'm like, you can take God at his word, you can trust him. And so I wanted to write this story. Of course not, I mean, some of the side benefits, right, is honoring my dad and recording his story, but really just because God was so faithful to me, like to my parents, to our family, and just for people to know in the midst of the broken things, the messy things, the hard things, like there's hope and faith works when life doesn't work. That's the tagline of the book. And so that I think was what kept me going in the, like, this is really hard to write this story. That was what kept me going. I want people to know that they can trust him.
So you received the phone call from your dad. You said 3 to 5 years is usually the prognosis when it comes to ALS. How long from phone call to when your father had passed?
15 months.
Oh,
yeah.
So, and this is where I want to weave in through this and be as, you know, because I find some of this difficult. Do you think having a finality in the 3 to 5 years, I mean, for your dad it was only 15 months, does it change your perspective of time? Because you only had, you know, what you thought maybe was 3 to 5 but was less than a year and a half.
Yeah, when my dad got the news from the neurologist, his first thought was, I'm going to see my Lord sooner than I thought.
wow.
And it absolutely puts like I think when your life is going really well and things are easy, you just think like, I have all the time in the world, things are great. And I don't really think that we actually long for heaven. It's like my life is good. And and through that 15 months of just like loss after loss after loss and like hard thing, I think I was like, this time on earth is short. I mean, the days are long when you're suffering, the days are long, but like the years are short. And I think there was this invitation maybe to live life for what matters, and my dad said, like, one of his kind of like last things he said was like, if you were to live today, like it was your last day on earth, what would you do to make a difference in the kingdom of God? And just that, right? Like, okay, so today I have my list of things to do and I got to pick up the kids and drop, but like what actually is going to matter in eternity? And I think when you begin to live your everyday life through that lens of like, these three things remain: faith, hope, and love. Like, is anything that I'm doing to do with any of those three things? Because really that's the only thing that's going to matter, and we lose sight of it. I lose sight of that so easily. So I think it absolutely, when it was like, you have 3 to 5 years, which became 15 months, it was like, okay, what matters? And it was like faith and family. Honestly, that was kind of it. And in a way it simplified life. It was like, what are you doing this weekend? I'm going home to like spend time with my dad because I don't know how many weekends we have left. And it just made things really simple. It was like, be present with God and present with the people you love. And really like everything else is details.
How did walking with your dad to his new beginning help you grieve once he was gone?
Actually, that's an interesting question.
Or did it not help? Maybe it didn't.
It did and it didn't. It was so fast, like in hindsight. So here I am, 2020, October 2020. And I'm like, I realized that this title I've had in my heart for a couple of years, this is my dad's story. And I start writing, and it was like slowing everything down. And I mean, if I had a bucket to collect all the tears, like I cried when I sat down to the computer. I mean, like I'd be swimming in this room right now. But I think actually writing the book was more of my grieving journey. Like it was so fast. And when you're in those really hard things and they're going really fast, you're like, just make it through, make it through, make it through, make it through. And yeah, there was like pockets of grief and tears, of course, but like just in a deeper way. Like I think it was harder. Like writing the book was a deeper level of grief and tears and anger. Like there was a lot of things that just hadn't really come out for me before. And it was, I think I did more grieving writing the book probably than I did when my dad was alive, because it was just so fast. And so I think the Lord was gracious in that way of just like slowing it down for me and just being with me as I processed and kind of went through it.
Sometimes we go through different kinds of why me moments. Now that you have walked and are walking the journey of grief, because I don't think you ever stop personally. No. It just changes. It looks different from day to day. I still can't listen to Kirk Franklin Smile without getting really sad and missing my grandma. So like we all have like these, and it's such a happy song. Like it's a great tune. You at a party with friends, they play it. I'm like, oh, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry. I'm so happy right now. I'm smiling. Yes, happy tears. Oh my gosh. But kind of coming now through the other side, quote unquote, you've got the book, it's in your hands. Have you ever experienced the why me moment on the other side of things where you feel humbled?
Yeah. I think like writing this book, like getting to the privilege of like teaching the word, to like groups of women. It's like one time my mom and I were on a plane together to Abbotsford going to do a leadership conference. And I'm like, how did we get here? Like, how did we get to this place of like having this privilege, like to serve God and to, get to teach women. And so we were both just kind of marveling at the goodness of God in the midst of, brokenness and all these things. So, I think sometimes there's the, like, God, why would you trust me to steward this message? Or, and honestly, like, I don't have an answer. I think sometimes all we get is, because you're willing to trust me and you're just willing to say yes, and it's funny because those are really simple things, but a lot of people are, like afraid to do them. And I started, when I started writing this book, like I'd never written a book proposal. I had never like submitted anything to an edit. Like, I mean, I just felt like God was like, write the book. So I was like, okay, I'll just write the book. And so I wrote the book, and then I'm like, well, now what? Like, and then, so I gave it to some people to read and was like, tell me what you think, and I'll, tweak. And 10 people were like, it's awesome. And 2 people were like, yeah, it's a good first draft. You need to give it a rigorous edit. And I was like, I don't know how to do that. And, I remember just feeling stuck and like, I don't know what to do next with this book. Like, I know I need to get this out. Everyone's like, when's the book going to be done? And I'm like, I wish I could tell you. And then a friend called me about a year ago in March, and she said, hey, there's this rep from Word of Life Press was in my mom's bookstore. They have this contest. I think you should enter. It's for unpublished finished manuscripts. And so then I was like, okay, well, that's what I got. And apparently it does need a pretty rigorous edit. So God just like, I think sometimes we get ahead of like, okay, what's step 2, 3, and 4? And he's like, just do 1. Like, I told you to write the book, and then I'll tell you what to do next. And then I'll tell you what to do next. And then I'll tell you what to do next after you do the last thing I told you to do. And so I think in everything, it's just, an invitation to walk by faith.
Anything but ordinarybook.ca at everydaytruthca. Steph, this has been amazing. Thank you for taking some time and sharing your heart.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I think we're friends now.
I think so. He said Steph. He said Steph, so.
It's Steph. My friends call me Steph, so
there you go.
We're in. We're all locked. Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you. Well, if you enjoyed what you heard today, like, subscribe, and check out more of our YouTube videos.
Don't forget to follow us on all the socials: Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and faithstrongtoday.com.